Dark clouds loom over an airport tarmac as an aging McDonnell Douglas MD-83 sits idle, awaiting its next flight. The paint is chipped, the fuselage weathered. For many passengers, this is just another routine flight. Another journey from Abuja to Lagos, the beating heart of Nigeria's commercial world. But for some, a strange unease lingers. They don't know it yet, but they are about to board a flight doomed from the moment it left the ground. Some airlines operate with precision, prioritizing safety at every turn. Others cut corners, taking risks they should never take. And then there's Dana Air, an airline whose name has become synonymous with negligence, corruption, and catastrophic failure. What happened on June 3, 2012, was no random tragedy. It was a disaster years in the making, the culmination of reckless decisions, ignored warnings, and a company culture that placed profits over lives. This is the story of Dana Air Flight 0992, one of the deadliest air crashes in Nigerian history. The morning of the flight was hot and humid, typical for Nigeria in June. At Nnamdi Azikiwe International Airport in Abuja, passengers filed into the departure lounge, some scrolling through their phones, others chatting excitedly about the trip ahead. Flight 0992 was scheduled to depart for Lagos, a journey of just over an hour. The aircraft assigned to this flight was a McDonnell Douglas MD-83, a model introduced in the 1980s, an aging workhorse that had served many airlines around the world. But what many passengers didn't know was the troubled history of this very plane. This aircraft, registration 5N RAM, was nearly 22 years old, originally operated by airlines in the United States before being passed down through different owners. It eventually ended up in the hands of Dana Air, a company that had rapidly expanded in Nigeria's aviation market despite growing concerns over its operational standards. The airline had already been flagged for multiple maintenance issues, with reports of frequent technical failures. But in an industry where regulations are often weakly enforced, Dana Air continued to operate, its aircraft flying thousands of passengers across Nigeria. At 2:58 p.m., Flight 0992 lifted off from Abuja, climbing into the sky with 153 people on board. Inside the cockpit, Captain Peter Waxstan, a 55-year-old American pilot with thousands of flight hours, was in command. His first officer, Mahendra Singh, sat beside him, monitoring the aircraft's instruments. For the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. The plane leveled off at its cruising altitude of 26,000 feet, moving steadily toward Lagos. But beneath the surface, something was wrong. For weeks, Dana Air's maintenance crew had been battling issues with this aircraft's engines. Pilots had reported power loss, strange noises, and inconsistent thrust. One crew had even warned that the left engine had been unreliable on a previous flight. Yet, instead of grounding the plane for thorough inspection, Dana Air kept it in service. The company was cutting costs, stretching its fleet to the limit. It was a disaster waiting to happen. As the aircraft cruised through the Nigerian skies, passengers settled in. Some gazed out of the small oval windows, watching the scattered clouds drift below. Others flipped through in-flight magazines, unaware of the silent ticking time bomb within the aircraft. At around 3:30 p.m., just 17 minutes before they were supposed to land in Lagos, the first signs of trouble appeared. In the cockpit, the pilots suddenly noticed a loss of power. The right engine, the same one that had been flagged multiple times before, began failing. The thrust dropped, and the plane's speed started to decay. Captain Waxstan and First Officer Singh tried to troubleshoot, adjusting throttle settings, checking fuel flow, and scanning their instruments for any sign of recovery. But before they could fully react, the left engine, now the only functioning power source, began to fail as well. The worst-case scenario was unfolding. A twin-engine aircraft can still fly with one engine, but a dual-engine failure at low altitude is a death sentence. The pilots frantically attempted to restart the engines, but nothing worked. The MD-83, now a 50-ton glider, began rapidly losing altitude. Outside, the passengers remained mostly unaware, though some could feel the unnatural drop in height. A few nervous glances were exchanged, but there was no announcement yet, no warning from the crew. Then came the turbulence, the sudden jolts as the pilot struggled to keep the aircraft stable. Some passengers gripped their armrests. Others whispered prayers under their breath. In the control tower at Murtala Muhammad International Airport in Lagos, air traffic controllers watched as Flight 0992 approached. They could hear the urgency in the pilots' voices as the distress call crackled through the radio. Mayday, mayday. Dual engine failure. We're losing altitude. Requesting emergency landing. But the aircraft was already too low, too slow. There was no altitude left to recover. From the ground, people in the crowded Ijuashaga neighborhood of Lagos heard the approaching roar of the aircraft. The MD-83 was now just a few hundred feet above the rooftops, struggling to stay in the air. Witnesses later recalled seeing the plane wobbling, barely holding on before it slammed into the ground. At exactly 3:43 p.m., Dana Air Flight 0992 crashed into a residential area, erupting into a massive fireball. Homes were destroyed, cars were crushed, and the impact site was engulfed in thick black smoke. There were no survivors on board. On the ground, at least 10 people lost their lives as the fiery wreckage consumed everything in its path. The horror was immediate. Residents screamed, running toward the burning wreckage in shock and disbelief. Some tried desperately to help, but there was nothing anyone could do. The aircraft had been completely destroyed, its passengers lost in an instant. This was not just a freak accident. It was a catastrophe years in the making, one that could have been prevented if Dana Air had taken safety seriously. Instead, 153 people were gone, their lives stolen by a company that ignored every warning sign. And this was only the beginning. In the days that followed, investigators would uncover a history of negligence, corruption, and incompetence. Dana Air's reputation, already fragile, would be shattered. And the families of the victims would be left to ask a heartbreaking question. Why did this airline continue flying when it was so clearly unfit to operate? The sun hung high over Lagos as Flight 0992 approached the city, its passengers unaware that the engines powering their journey were moments away from total failure. Inside the cockpit, Captain Peter Waxstan and First Officer Mahendra Singh monitored their instruments, but something was wrong. The right engine, which had already been a source of concern in previous flights, was losing power. The aircraft, a 22-year-old McDonnell Douglas MD-83, began slowing down, struggling to maintain altitude. Then, in a terrifying cascade of failure, the left engine started failing as well. A commercial airliner losing one engine is serious, but manageable. Losing both engines, however, is a nightmare scenario, especially at low altitude. Flight 0992 had no chance of gliding safely to the airport. It was doomed. Inside the plane, the first signs of distress were subtle. Passengers noticed a strange silence, the hum of the engines weakening, and the unsettling sensation of sinking. A few exchanged nervous glances, but there had been no announcement from the cockpit yet. In the cabin, flight attendants carried on as normal, though some began sensing that something wasn't right. In the cockpit, chaos erupted. The flight crew scrambled to diagnose the issue. Warning lights flashed, alarms blared, and the aircraft's controls felt sluggish. The engines had both flamed out, leaving the pilots with no power to keep the MD-83 in the sky. At just 11 miles from the runway, the aircraft was plummeting toward the ground. Mayday, mayday. Captain Waxston's voice crackled through the radio. Dual engine failure. We're losing altitude. Requesting emergency landing. Air traffic control responded immediately, granting clearance for an emergency approach. But the MD-83 was already far too low, dropping rapidly toward the city below. Waxstan and Singh desperately attempted an engine restart. They adjusted throttle settings, tried fuel flow adjustments, and cycled the ignition. Nothing worked. The engines remained lifeless. The aircraft continued to fall. The pilots, realizing that they had mere seconds to act, focused on keeping the nose up, trying to extend their glide as much as possible. But the MD-83 was not a glider. Without engine power, its descent was brutal and unforgiving. In the passenger cabin, panic had set in. People gripped their armrests, some whispering prayers, others crying silently. A mother clutched her child tightly. The descent was faster now, the windows flashing with glimpses of the densely packed neighborhood below. Buildings and rooftops came into view far too quickly. The ground was coming up to meet them. On the ground in Lagos, residents of the crowded Abuja neighborhood heard the low, unnatural whine of an aircraft descending far too fast. Shopkeepers and pedestrians looked up, their eyes widening as they saw the massive MD-83 hurtling toward them. The aircraft wobbled in its final moments, desperate attempts by the pilots to maintain control proving futile. Then, at exactly 3:43 p.m., Flight 0992 slammed into the ground. The impact was immediate and devastating. The aircraft plowed through a two-story building before exploding into a massive fireball, sending thick black smoke billowing into the sky. The neighborhood was instantly engulfed in chaos. Debris rained down, flames erupted, and the air filled with the sounds of screaming and sirens. For the 153 people on board, there was no chance of survival. The force of the impact and subsequent explosion left nothing but twisted wreckage. On the ground, at least 10 more people were killed instantly as the plane tore through homes and businesses, destroying everything in its path. Eyewitnesses stood frozen in horror before rushing toward the crash site, desperately searching for survivors. But the wreckage was an inferno, the intense heat making any rescue attempt impossible. Some residents could do nothing but watch as the flames consumed what was left of the aircraft. Within minutes, emergency responders arrived. Firefighters, paramedics, and military personnel descended upon the scene, struggling to control the blaze. Fire crews worked tirelessly, battling the flames as plumes of dark smoke choked the sky. But it was too late. The passengers, the crew, and several residents of Abuja had perished. As news of the disaster spread, families of those on board rushed to the airport, desperate for answers. Many broke down upon hearing the confirmation. There were no survivors. The grief was overwhelming, the loss immeasurable. Authorities quickly launched an investigation. The Nigerian Civil Aviation Authority, along with international experts, began sifting through the wreckage, searching for the aircraft's black boxes, critical flight data, and cockpit voice recordings that would reveal the final moments of Flight 0992. When the black boxes were finally recovered, the findings were damning. The flight data confirmed what many had already suspected. Both engines had failed, and the crew had been left powerless to save the aircraft. But the real horror came when investigators dug deeper into the airline's history. Dana Air had been operating under a cloud of safety concerns for years. Maintenance records showed that the very aircraft involved in the crash had suffered from repeated engine failures in the weeks leading up to the disaster. Pilots had raised concerns about unreliable power, but management had dismissed them. The airline, desperate to keep its schedule running, had ignored clear warnings. This wasn't just an accident. It was a tragedy born from neglect. Dana Air had gambled with lives, and 163 people had paid the price. As the scale of the disaster became clear, the Nigerian government grounded Dana Air, banning the airline from operating. Protests erupted, with families demanding justice. But for those who lost loved ones, no punishment, no investigation, no grounding of an airline could bring them back. In the end, Flight 0992 became a symbol of everything wrong with airline safety oversight, a grim reminder of what happens when profits take precedence over human lives. And for the families left behind, the horror of that day will never fade. As night fell over the crash site, the fires finally died down, leaving behind only the charred remains of an aircraft that should never have been in the air. The worst part? This tragedy could have been prevented. The warnings were there. The failures were known. But no one had acted in time. And for the passengers of Dana Air Flight 0992, time had run out. The wreckage of Dana Air Flight 0992 lay smoldering in the middle of a densely populated Lagos neighborhood, a grim reminder of the lives lost in an accident that should never have happened. The thick black smoke from the crash site was visible for miles, marking the location where 153 passengers and crew had perished, along with several people on the ground. As emergency responders combed through the devastation, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. This was not just an unfortunate tragedy, it was a preventable disaster, the result of years of negligence, ignored warnings, and an airline that prioritized profit over safety. In the hours following the crash, the Nigerian government announced an immediate investigation. The Nigerian Civil Aviation Authority, NCAA, along with accident investigators from the United States and other aviation bodies, began analyzing the wreckage. The priority was to recover the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, the black boxes, which would reveal the events leading up to the catastrophic failure of both engines. When the black boxes were recovered and examined, the findings were damning. The cockpit voice recordings captured the final moments of Flight 0992, the confusion and desperation of the pilots as they fought to keep the plane in the air, their failed attempts to restart the engines, and the realization that they were going down. The flight data showed that both engines had suffered a loss of power, a rare and devastating occurrence that raised immediate red flags. How could an aircraft experience dual-engine failure mid-flight? The answer lay in Dana Air's maintenance practices, or rather, the lack of them. As investigators dug deeper into the airline's records, a disturbing picture emerged. The MD-83 involved in the crash had been plagued with mechanical issues long before June 3, 2012. Pilots had repeatedly reported problems with the engines, including power losses and irregular performance. In the weeks leading up to the crash, the aircraft had suffered multiple in-flight shutdowns, clear indications that something was seriously wrong. But instead of grounding the plane for thorough inspection and repair, Dana Air continued operating it, dismissing concerns and cutting corners on maintenance. Further examination of the aircraft's maintenance logs revealed even more shocking details. The engines had been running on contaminated fuel, which had contributed to their failure. Fuel contamination is a serious issue in aviation, as it can clog fuel lines, reduce engine efficiency, and ultimately lead to power loss. The signs had been there for weeks, yet Dana Air failed to address them. The airline's disregard for safety wasn't limited to just this one aircraft. Investigators found a pattern of negligence across the entire fleet. Several of Dana Air's planes had been flagged for mechanical issues, but instead of following proper safety procedures, the airline prioritized keeping its flights on schedule. Maintenance was performed hastily, often without thorough inspections, and sometimes critical repairs were ignored altogether. The company's culture was one of recklessness, with a management team more focused on maximizing profits than ensuring passenger safety. As the investigation continued, public outrage grew. Families of the victims demanded accountability. How had Dana Air been allowed to operate despite such glaring safety failures? Why had regulators failed to step in before disaster struck? These were questions that the Nigerian government was forced to confront. In response to the crash, Dana Air's operating license was suspended indefinitely. The airline was grounded, its operations put under intense scrutiny. But for many, this action came too late. The damage had already been done. 153 people were dead, and no amount of grounding or regulatory action could bring them back. Beyond the immediate consequences for Dana Air, the crash of Flight 0992 exposed deeper issues within Nigeria's aviation industry. The country had long struggled with safety oversight, with many airlines operating under questionable conditions. Corruption, lack of enforcement, and financial pressures had created an environment where airlines could get away with cutting corners. Dana Air was not the first Nigerian airline to be accused of neglecting safety, but its failure was one of the most egregious. For the families of the victims, the crash left a wound that would never heal. Many of them had loved ones who had trusted Dana Air to get them safely to their destination. Instead, they had been betrayed by an airline that valued its bottom line more than human lives. Memorials were held across Nigeria, honoring those who had lost their lives in the disaster. The grief was overwhelming, but so was the anger. Protesters took to the streets, demanding stricter safety regulations and harsher penalties for airlines that failed to prioritize passenger safety. The crash became a turning point in Nigeria's aviation industry, forcing regulators to take a hard look at their policies and oversight mechanisms. In the aftermath of the crash, the Nigerian government vowed to reform its aviation sector. Investigations led to new policies aimed at preventing similar disasters. Airlines were subjected to more rigorous inspections, and penalties for non-compliance were increased. But for many Nigerians, the question remained, would these changes be enough? Or would another disaster occur because of the same negligence and greed that had doomed Flight 0992? Dana Air eventually resumed operations, but its reputation was forever tarnished. Many Nigerians refused to fly with the airline, seeing it as a symbol of corruption and incompetence. Trust in the country's aviation industry was deeply shaken, and for good reason. The crash of Flight 0992 was more than just an accident. It was a failure of an entire system. It was a warning, a stark reminder of what happens when safety is compromised in the name of profit. And for those who lost loved ones in the disaster, the fight for justice and accountability would never end. The wreckage of Flight 0992 was eventually cleared, the debris removed from the streets of Lagos, but the memory of that fateful day would never be erased. The lives lost in the crash became a tragic testament to the cost of negligence, a story that should have never been written but one that the world could never afford to forget.